Hey engineers, DigRock here. Today I wanted to ideate a bit on how heat management could work as a vanilla mechanic within Space Engineers 2. The last video I made was about shields and survivability in response to talk about shields possibly being included in Space Engineers 2 and some mechanics that could be incorporated before messing with shields. The video had a ton of feedback and comments on it, so I actually started scripting a response video, but I actually realized that a lot of responses were oriented around one theme, which was heat. Heat is a massive consideration for aerospace engineering, yet up to this point, Space Engineers has pretty much entirely ignored it, even though pretty much every other space game out there uses heat in a variety of ways. So I wanted to bring this up now while SE2 is still under development and get the community collaborating on it before it becomes a fully landed game. If you want heat management in SE2, there is already a feature request on Keen's website. It has almost 100 upvotes and is right now marked under consideration. So if it's something you want, go and hit that upvote and leave a comment on that feature request, and maybe we can push this thing over the edge and get heat management as a feature in Space Engineers 2. To prep for this video, I actually ran a poll on Reddit asking if heat should be included, of which 70% of the responses were yes, it should be included. And I also scoured the web for other posts and forum content about possible heat mechanics, of which there's a lot of feedback to pull from, in addition to existing ideas from current heat mods in Space Engineers 1. When I went through all the feedback, I paid close attention to the reasons people didn't want heat management in the game, and believe it or not, there actually is a really solid solution here. And so I'll be proposing a heat system that ideally checks all the boxes. From a player standpoint, the goals are to make it easy for new players, following Keen's visions of keeping a low learning curve to entice new players to come play the game. Incorporate advanced fine-tuning elements for players who want to engineer beyond the basics, following Keen's vision of preparation should matter. And also, one of the goals will be to help increase survivability through combat balances. And from a development standpoint, this mechanic has to not be a hurdle, so it needs to require very few additional blocks, at least initially, be simple to implement, and also have minimal performance impact. In a nutshell, the whole system can actually work using a basic UI gauge, just 2 initial cooling blocks, and automatic safety shutoffs to keep modules from cooking themselves. Just like power moves through a grid abstractly, heat can too. No pipes, no complicated systems, just a clean, simple mechanic that feels right at home in Space Engineers. But first, why heat? As mentioned, temperature control systems are a major part of aerospace design today. Getting rid of waste heat in space requires some active cooling systems because radiating heat in a vacuum passively is a very slow process. It's actually such a major factor in space that almost every modern space game today incorporates heat in some way, so it's a primary sci-fi mechanic that players have already grown accustomed to managing. If you have no understanding of heat in spaceships, there's an amazing video by Space Doc, which has an absolutely banger video on radiators that I would recommend watching. I will link to that below. More importantly, for Space Engineers, having some type of heat mechanic not only makes engineering more interesting and also glowing hot radiators look super cool, but it can be like a viable way to balance combat. When I proposed this mechanic outline on my Discord, Strikoki said it best, and apologies I probably messed up that pronunciation. Players who are making massive ships should be the ones that need to focus the most on this mechanic as to prevent gun spam death bricks that have a million reactors and shields too if they're added. Creating a realistic balance to combat increases survivability. And honestly, it's just fun. It gives you something to juggle during combat, especially since a lot of the combat is automated through turrets anyway. It also introduces new vulnerabilities to combat because now cooling can become a targetable subsystem with your turrets and AI blocks in combat. Heat would also tie in perfectly with heat signature sensors too, which is something I talked about in the last video, and that was a feature that received just like massively wild support. You could even run a stealth build by internalizing your heat to keep your heat signature low, but you'd be flirting with overheating the whole time. So there's a lot of ways that heat could make the Almagest just much more dynamic. So now that some justification for heat is out of the way, let's talk about the cooling blocks. As grids use modules, they will accumulate waste heat. Grids will passively radiate heat, but very slowly with some cooling bonus if a module is externally exposed. However, the most effective way to shed heat would be through 2 cooling blocks. 2 blocks to run a system is pretty typical for almost every other category of blocks in Space Engineers. For example, propulsion is thrusters plus fuel tanks, building is refinery plus assembler, power is power generator plus batteries. So heat management also only needs 2 blocks as well, radiators and heat sinks. So let's start with radiators. Radiators only require power to run a heat pump / heat exchanger. Heat is abstracted to move through your grid, similar to power, so it requires no conveyors or piping, and heat is pumped to radiators where it will actively radiate heat away from your grid. These only work externally and are more efficient the more exposed they are. Players can choose to have radiator blocks recessed or partially covered for protection, but they will work less efficiently. This works similar to windmills, how windmills, their efficiency is tied to surrounding clutter. One radiator block can have a max amount of heat it can pump, store, and shed per second, requiring complex builds to have more radiators to keep up with higher heat production. Initially, I would just propose radiators being flat panels that come in different sizes, like a similar form factor to a solar panel. However, future expansions of the game could introduce new radiator blocks, such as retractable radiators like we see on the International Space Station, or potentially more armored radiators which trade efficiency for durability. Aside from their great functionality, glowing radiators would just look so freaking sweet. Now, radiators are great, but sometimes you might need to handle a sudden spike of heat, and radiators might just not be able to keep up. That's where heat sinks, or thermal batteries, come into play. Heat sinks also use a little power, again, just to run an abstract heat pump or exchanger. Heat sinks can be placed either internally or externally, but they don't shed much heat on their own. Instead, their job is just to store surplus heat during spikes of activity. They essentially act as a safety buffer, or during stealth runs where you might want to turn off your radiators to conceal your heat signature and just let your heat store on the internalized heat sinks. If a heatsink gets completely overloaded, it could shut off intake to avoid destroying itself, or it could just fail dramatically, depending on how punishing the system should be in the event of destruction or combat. Otherwise, these two blocks are really all that you need to manage like a cooling system and have heat incorporated into Space Engineers. Later in the video, I will talk about some other optional blocks that could expand on things even further, including a few great ideas that people in my Discord shared after I posted the outline. Also, if it seems like I spend a lot of time on these videos, I really do. There's a ton of prep work for this and stuff. So please hit the like button, please. Now, I would like to take a moment to discuss the game logic of how I envision the heat system would work. I mostly want to include this because some mods and features I've seen people discuss with what they want in a heat system is having heat as like an actual physical calculated element that like exists in the environment. Sort of similar to light, which is super performance heavy, and I would imagine a system like that is pretty much a non-starter for the devs. But I think there is a way around this where heat can pretty much be entirely done as just as like a simple background calculation, which is something that I think actually a lot of the heat mods in SE1 currently do. But there is a lot of mods, and there is some like compatibility issues with a lot of them, which just like further shows why this would be great as a base vanilla mechanic, because it just will never break and just be part of the game natively. So for the sake of simplicity, I will introduce a unit called heat units. Every module produces heat while operating, and each module has an ideal operating temperature. And any heat above that operating temperature is surplus heat, which produces heat units. High demand blocks like drills or refineries would naturally produce more heat units per second than low demand blocks like detectors or cryo chambers. All heat units generated on your grid get pumped to your radiators. Each radiator can get rid of a certain number of heat units per second. If your radiators can't keep up, extra heat units spill into your heat sinks. Altogether, your radiators and heat sinks have a total capacity shown in the UI as a gauge, and once that hits 100%, your modules can't offload heat anymore into the cooling system. At that point, each module starts to store heat inside of itself. Now, one nuance to keep in mind with your grid is that individual modules can overheat even if your heat capacity isn't full. Radiators and heat sinks can only pump so many heat units per second into their own systems. So if you have something like a bunch of turrets firing nonstop, there is a potential where modules could generate heat faster than your system can pull it away. In this scenario, I see icons appearing on your HUD to let you know that certain subsystems are overheating, even if your heat capacity level is not full. But obviously the main fix is simple, just add more cooling blocks so that they can pump more heat units away from modules per second. Different modules can have varying levels of heat units they can tolerate storing within themselves before they start to receive damage. And a simple formula could be that modules can store 10 seconds of their own heat output before they start taking damage. What's great about this is it gives players a very clear rhythm. If you max out your cooling, you've got a brief window to shut things down and let your cooling systems catch up, giving players a chance to respond before their modules take damage. But as soon as a module does start storing its own heat, it is considered overheated and loses efficiency based on how much stored heat it has. And if the module keeps running past its stored heat limit, it takes damage. Now, when a module takes damage, sensitive components, things like computers, power supplies, reactor components, should fail first, long before the block is completely destroyed. They would fall below that non-functional line that you see when you're building and repairing modules. The reason I take the time to outline all of this is this is just math happening behind the scenes. There's no physical heat simulation, so it stays performance friendly, which has to be a super key component. The only major performance impact here is how damage is applied to the block itself. This gets into territory where I'm a bit ignorant, so I'll leave that to the devs to decide for themselves. Though some type of visual modeling like smoke or char marks coming out of burnt components probably would be warranted and also help identifying which modules need repair. Otherwise, as modules take damage, the building components could just be removed from them over time. So depending on what type of block it is, maybe excess heat causes some type of critical failure, perhaps maybe a boom of sorts. Speaking of explosions, remember earlier when I mentioned built-in safety features? I think as an addition to heat management, all heat-producing modules should have an additional block setting, which is a heat safety shutoff. This toggleable safety option would be on by default, and if a module hits its max stored heat units, it simply shuts off the module until the module cools down and then comes back on again. It's an easy way to keep newer or even offline players from accidentally cooking their ships. This can also be handy for any automated or passive grids which you aren't actively monitoring to make sure they don't destroy themselves. Modules can also be shut off using an event controller. A grid's heat capacity and the stored heat within a specific module could be settings that are monitored by an event controller. An example of why this would be useful: let's say your grid is getting to 90% heat capacity. You might have an event controller monitor this and shut off all non-essential modules such as refineries or assemblers until your grids cool down a little bit more. This could also be useful to prioritize certain systems in combat scenarios where you're taking a lot of excess heat, or just prevent runaway heat buildup, especially in the event of your cooling systems being destroyed. Crucially, anytime a automatic heat-related event happens, there should be feedback to the player so they know heat was the cause, similar to how we have vocal cues for energy low. We could also have vocal and display notices for reactors offline, or heat capacity critical. This will naturally teach new players that heat is a mechanic to pay attention to, and also keep the engineer informed about if their grid is melting or not. There are also some trade-offs and environmental influence that heat can play. Grids can passively shed a bit of heat, more so in atmosphere, and probably a lot more if the grid is underwater, but very little in a vacuum. So heat becomes a bigger concern the farther you get away from atmospheric planets. That means new players on a starter world won't feel overwhelmed by this mechanic, but as you journey more into space, you become more aware of its presence and adapt accordingly. The cooling coefficient could also change based on ambient temperature, so a grid at the top of a frozen mountain might stay cool easier than a grid that's like on a dry desert planet, with maybe some bonus points if there's some heat buildup on atmospheric entry. But regardless of how nuanced the system is, the beauty of a system like this is that it mostly stays out of your way during peaceful gameplay. Once you've got cooling that matches the heat output on a grid, you're pretty much good on that grid until you start adding more modules. Heat could also be a major concern for grids that are relying on shields, if Keen does end up adding these to the game. This was a major talking point with the feedback as it relates to heat, where shields could both contribute to heat buildup because shield generators would have to be pumping a lot of energy to suspend a shield, and also they could choke radiator efficiency because the shield bubble could trap in heat or even just potentially produce heat because of whatever the material of the shield is itself. We get into that much deeper on the other video, not going to get into here, but the point is it would create a serious trade-off for having such a huge defensive boon. And it also could limit the amount of grids that are just passively flying around with a bubble on 100% of the time. The real tension shows up in combat, where radiators can be destroyed, heat sinks can fill up, and weapons can rapidly push you over your cooling limit. Targeting someone's radiators could force them to disengage from combat early, with the additional potential for heat to build up as you take damage, especially the explosive kind. Also, modules that are fully enclosed inside of armor should run hotter than ones that are exposed to the outside. So the more armored your build is, the more heat it'll retain and the more cooling you'll need to keep that combat grid cool. And honestly, combat is where this heat mechanic should be most impactful, because right now there is no consequence to having a brick loaded to the gills with turrets and jump drives, which is super ridiculous and just like absolutely arcadey. In Merrick's own words, preparation should matter. There's no preparation in just arbitrarily bolting 50 turrets onto your grid and just blitzing an enemy. So this kind of heat system makes preparation and smart engineering matter a whole lot. And to be clear, you could still bolt on 50 turrets and charge an enemy. You just might overheat and melt your grid. So if that's something you want to do, have fun. So radiators and heat sinks would suffice to manage heat. However, there are opportunities to expand on this in the future, should Keen choose to do so. So let's discuss some optional blocks. Heat recyclers. Put simply, heat recyclers will convert heat into usable energy. There are various devices that exist which can do similar things, such as Stirling modules and Peltier modules, with various levels of efficiency. Shout out to one of my Discord users, PhD Composer, for expanding on the idea of heat recyclers and pointing out these specific devices. I'm not an expert on heat recyclers, but of course the science can be easily abstracted. You could potentially have a very low efficiency heat recycler earlier on, but the best version would be like a late game prototech or exotic tech level block. It wouldn't replace radiators and just grant unlimited free energy. It would just turn a small amount of stored heat into a bit of power. Now, balancing how much heat it can process could be tricky, so it isn't just exploited and replace an entire cooling system, which is why I see this as more of an exotic tech level item. And potentially, instead of removing heat from the system, it could just use some of the heat passing through the system rather than consuming the heat, so it's an inline system and not some type of like cooling cheat. Water flushing. Since SE2 will have water and storage tanks, you could use water to rapidly cool overheated modules in an emergency heating situation. Basically, the ship could blast water through the conveyor network, soak up the heat of the attached modules, and then vent that water as steam through a dedicated block or even just a connector. This would be great for quick cooldowns, but the trade-off is that you burn through a lot of water, which is heavy and takes up a lot of space. So I envision this as more of like an emergency tool, sort of like a last-ditch effort, rather than like a main cooling method. And I don't know how it would work for non-conveyored systems like batteries and things like that. Maybe there's just like a plate that attaches to a conveyor port and anything you put on that plate gets water cooling. Obviously, this gets really nuanced and complex very fast, which is why I'm proposing this as an optional thing and not a main part of the heat mechanic in the game. Efficiency modules. Modules like refineries and assemblers have ports for efficiency modules. So an additional bonus module could be included which improves heat efficiency, which could make it produce less heat units at a slower rate and allow it to store more heat units before it takes damage. Managing heat doesn't have to be exclusive to space either. There are two blocks that could be used on planets with an atmosphere. Air vents. Air vents are a cooling block which can be used in atmosphere and provide cooling simply by pumping out hot air. This might not be necessary as ships will already have improved passive cooling in atmosphere and radiators would see drastic improvements to efficiency, so many low heat generating grids might not even need any type of cooling at all and can get away with just passive cooling. However, this could be like a fun consideration and a way to rapidly cool grids which are generating tons of heat, such as like small mining ships. Also, underground bases don't have much exposure, so air vents could be a way to remove heat from an underground grid. Lastly, we have turbines. My Discord brought up turbines as another block to make energy with heat. When in atmosphere, excess heat could be used to heat up water, to generate steam, to turn a turbine, which is a super common way of generating power today in many forms. With the addition of water in this game, this is just sort of like a logical use for heat, but obviously would require massive water consumption, and thus would only be viable on planets with water. And potentially the resulting steam cloud could make your base highly visible. So just some final notes on heat management to address some things that will likely appear in comments. But still leave your thoughts in the comments below. I respond to all of them. So I imagine heat would be a setting you can toggle off globally for your world if it's something you didn't want to deal with at all, just like air tightness and other settings in the game. Potentially with a slider even to adjust how hardcore you want heat to build up so you can make it easy or hard or nothing at all. Heat could also potentially be made more immersive where internal areas in your grid could get hot and to the point where blocks around there take damage, and maybe it's even too dangerous for you to enter into the room. But for the sake of this video, I just wanted to outline a low performance, low learning curve solution, and we'll let Keen choose to if they want to take it farther or not. But I know that was something that was talked about a lot in the other video about heat. In the previous video, we talked about relative top speeds with the ability to actively boost above your speed limit, where you get the bonus only when you're actively using extra thrust. Actions like boosting, where you're pushing your grid, could cause an increase in heat building up, creating dynamic tension. Maybe you're trying to evade somebody, but your heat buildup is building up rapidly in the process. Hot heat sinks could also be launched away from your ship and serve as a decoy for any heat signature sensors or heat-guided weapons, with the potential for them to even be used as weapons themselves if they're hot enough and launched fast enough. Radiators could be placed behind blast doors or some type of hinged armor so that during combat you can hide your radiators and just rely on your heat sinks during that protection, but ensure your radiators aren't destroyed. And in the future, there could be combat versions of radiators where you can close the radiator itself to get increased durability, but obviously lose efficiency of the radiator. Heat can also bring a balance to internal welding. So a lot of people often place welders below like core components of their ship to make sure they stay repaired during combat. This could still work. However, the internalized welders would produce a lot of extra heat, creating trade-offs to grids that are basically just infinitely repairing themselves and currently don't have any consequence for that. As mentioned before, underground bases might be producing a lot of excess heat they can't get rid of and need to have like a radiator near the surface. However, underground bases would also benefit from extra protection because it would be a lot harder to drill down into the base and try to like bypass its entrances. So if an enemy were to stumble across your base and they didn't have a mining rig that could handle a lot of cooling to just like drill through a mountain to bypass your entire base, you would have some protection there. And at the very least, the opponent would have to come prepared. And speaking of drilling, handheld tools could also overheat, which would help balance hydromanning, where players can just charge a grid with a grinder or a drill and just start tearing a grid apart from the inside. And would also help balance like surface buildings, where right now players can just dig a gopher hole with a hand drill and just gopher themselves to a grid and just bypass the entire grid with zero consequence. Also with the potential for the boosters on your backpack to overheat as well, making it harder for you to chase down an enemy grid. Hydromanning has come up a few times in my Discord and comes up all the time on Reddit as something that is a little too meta, so this could just be another mechanic that helps balance that. Overall, I think that this heat system is a good stepping stone for how we can get heat into Space Engineers 2, with it having a low learning curve and not be very performance intensive. I think if we just can get this in Space Engineers 2 earlier than later, that would be awesome so people can build and prepare for it accordingly. And again, if you want heat in Space Engineers 2, be sure to click that link below for the feature request on Keen's website. And in the meantime, we'll see you in the Almagest. Godspeed, engineers.